Good morning, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva Males, and I hope that you're well. Today is Friday. It's April 9th. We're getting ready for Parshas Shemini, and I want to share a short Devar Torah with you. We know that Parshas Shemini begins telling us of the great tragedy that Klal Yisrael experienced with the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, the two older sons of Aharon HaKohen, that on the 8th day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, when everybody was celebrating that the Shekhinah had descended and is residing amongst Bnei Yisrael, Nadav and Avihu, they take fire pans, unauthorized, they bring a ketores, and they die. They die a fiery death before Hashem and before the entire Bnei Yisrael. The pasuk says, Vayichu Bnei Aaron, the two sons, the older sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, ish machtaso. Each one took his machta. Each one took his fire pan, and they brought them. So it says as follows. The Yalkut Shmoni, the Medrash says, what does it mean, ish machtaso, that each one took this fire pan? Ishme atzmo, each one acted independently. They didn't consult one another. They didn't ask each other's advice. So what does that medrash imply? Had they consulted one another, had they asked each other's advice, is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? They would have arrived at the proper conclusion, perhaps, and that could have stopped them from carrying out this unauthorized ketores, and they could have saved their lives. They wouldn't have died in this great tragedy. That's what the medrash implies. I remember when I was in yeshiva hearing the following message from my Rosh Yeshiva, from Rav Henach Leibowitz Zatzal. I remember hearing him talk about this medrash on many occasions. And here's what his question, and here's what he observed. He says, what does this medrash imply? That had they consulted with one another, they may have arrived at the proper conclusion. But I don't understand. The medrash says, Ishmei Atzmo, each one independently acted. Each one had already arrived at the conclusion that bringing an unauthorized ketores was the right thing to do. It made sense. So what would have changed if they consulted one another? We know their positions. We know where they stand. Each one thinks it's a great idea to talk. They'll just reinforce each other. What would have been prevented? How could this tragedy have been prevented if they'd only spoken with one another and communicated? That's his question. And his answer was, what do you have to say? What does the medrash seem to imply? Even if two parties have their positions, we know what their positions are. If they engage in communication, if they start speaking to one another, they bounce ideas off of one another. There's an exchange of ideas, something radically different can occur. They can realize this is a mistake. This isn't a good idea. Once we start speaking a matter through, it could be with a teacher, a mentor, a friend, a spouse. Once we start speaking it through, that we start brainstorming with one another, we can arrive at a completely different conclusion than when we began, even if both parties were initially on the same page. So it's such a great thing to do, to go and speak with someone, whether it's a teacher, a mentor, a spouse, a friend, whoever it is. Speak matters through, especially when they may have grave consequences. He would always quote us a famous pasuk in Melachim Aleph. In the first book of Melachim, David HaMelech is on his deathbed. He's going to die. The pasuk says, "Vayikrevu yemei David lamus, vayitzav Shlomo ben Olemor." David HaMelech was approaching his end, so he calls in his son Shlomo, who's going to be the next king, and he says, "I've got my last will and testament. I've got some very important instructions for you." And the very first thing he tells Shlomo is, Anochi olech b'der kol haaretz. I'm going the way of the world. Soon I'm going to pass away. V'chazakta v'yisalish. I need you to be strong. I need you to be a man. So what does that mean? Is he telling Shlomo HaMelech he's got to get a good physical trainer? He's got to go to the gym? What is he telling him? V'chazakta v'yisalish. I need you to be strong and be a man. And the Rabbi, one of our great Rishonim, he points out on this pasuk, what does he say? How does he explain this? He says, I don't want you to be a tza'ir. I don't want you to be a nar. I don't want you to be immature. What is the sign of immaturity? He says, I want you to be an ish chazak. What is the sign of maturity? What is that I want from you? Aval tiena pulos ish gadol. Don't be immature. Rather, be a mature, strong man. That means the hallmark, the sign of a man, of a mature individual, is that they are turning to others for eitzah. They're consulting others. They're asking others for advice. They're bouncing ideas off one another. They're not going through life thinking that they're an island, that they're a rock, and they don't need anybody else's input. That's how we end up making big mistakes, especially when the consequences could be so great. But if we consult with others, we bounce ideas off others. Again, it would be great if it's a teacher, if it's a mentor, someone who's got a greater degree of Torah knowledge. That's the best. But even other than that, if it's a friend, a spouse, just being involved in an exchange of ideas, brainstorming, that can help us arrive at completely different conclusions and see different aspects to a scenario that we may not have considered in the first place. And therefore, it is imperative, it's absolutely essential that we consult others, being shoel eitzah, turning to others for advice, for guidance, just checking in, saying, am I approaching this correctly? It's so important. I can tell you personally, this past week alone, on a number of occasions I did this. I sent out letters to a number of different Rabban and poskim about something that had come up over Pesach, just saying, did I approach this correctly? Did I understand this correctly? Was I being too sensitive about this? I've spoken to some friends asking. This comes up all the time, and it's important. We need to do this. We can't go through life thinking that I have all the answers and I don't need to touch base with others. If we do that, we may find ourselves making grave mistakes, similar to Nadav and Avihu. God willing, we'll all touch base with others, we'll consult others, and we'll be saved from the fate of Nadav and Avihu. And not just that we'll be saved, but we'll end up doing great things for ourselves, our families, our communities, and for Klal Yisrael. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.